So good evening and welcome to this plenary public lecture of the conference Transhumanism, Posthumanism and Supernaturalism of the 2018 Ian Ramsey Centre Summer Conference. Our speaker this evening is Professor Alister McGrath. Professor McGrath holds the Andreas Idrius Chair in Science and Religion at the Faculty of Theology and Religion here at the University of Oxford. He's also a Professor of Divinity at Gresham College and is the director of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. His main research interest at present is the area of thought traditionally known as natural theology, a theme of his Gifford lectures at the University of Aberdeen in 2009 and his Halcyon lectures at the University of Cambridge. A former atheist, he's also known for his opposition to new atheism and his advocacy of theological critical realism. Among his best-known books are The Twilight of Atheism, The Dawkins Delusion, Dawkins' God, Genes, Memes, and the Meaning of Life, and A Scientific Theology. And when discussing the theme of tonight's conference with Alister, I was very keen to have something on C.S. Lewis, because he's a great C.S. Lewis scholar. But also, as a teenager, I was a huge enthusiast for the writings of C.S. Lewis. I particularly remember The Abolition of Man and a novel based on the Abolition of Man called That Hideous Strength. These really shaped my thinking a lot as a teenager. I would really wanted to explore what C.S. Lewis would have made of the transhumanism debate. So in the discussions, I asked Alister whether he'd be willing to speak on this theme, and he very kindly agreed. So the title of the talk tonight, The Transformation of Humanity or the Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis and the Transhumanism Debate. Would you please welcome Professor Alister McGrath.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's very, very good to be here, and let me just begin by welcoming all of you who are here tonight. Whether you're here for the conference or you're just here as our guest, we're absolutely delighted to have you. And what I want to do in this lecture is really open up this theme about what transhumanism, what posthumanism, what sort of issues are raised by this. And C.S. Lewis is a wonderful dialogue partner to engage with. But let me just begin by saying something about the Ian Ramsey Centre itself, because we just need to tell people who we are, what kind of things we are doing. We were established in Oxford back in 1985, and obviously we've developed considerably since then. I think it's fair to say that our key objectives really are now to promote high-quality teaching, research, and knowledge dissemination in the field of science and religion here at Oxford. And we are delighted that the field of science and religion is now so heavily embedded here at Oxford. It is at present the most popular optional subject for students studying theology for the final honours school. There's a very vigorous Master of Studies program in it. We have a very good doctoral program, and we now have postdoctoral students in this field. So we're absolutely delighted that things are going so well. And more recently, we have taken a step which I think I ought to tell you about, and that's the Ian Ramsey Centre Studies in Science and Religion. And it is part of our vision of trying to encourage research, to engage in public debates, and of course, to encourage knowledge dissemination. And the first 2 volumes in this series will follow next year with others in development, and we are talking to people about future possibilities. So we are very interested in having those conversations. The first of these volumes will be by myself, and this is called The Territories of Human Reason, Science and Theology in an Age of Multiple Rationalities. And some of you will probably guess from the title there's a similarity here with Peter Harrison's excellent book, The Territories of Science and Religion, but actually this book is picking up an earlier agenda from a very interesting collection of German essays going back to 1996, the One Reason and Multiple Rationalities, in effect saying, look, we need to take account of the fact that as we engage different disciplinary areas, different ways of reasoning emerge in response to the tasks of those fields, and yet it is the one human reason that is engaging with all these. What are the implications for interdisciplinarity? What are the implications for the dialogue between science and theology? The second book is an edited volume by Peter Harrison and John Robinson. And this, I think, is a fascinating collection of essays. They are wonderful essays. They include contributions by the editors, Michael Roos, John Hedley-Brooke, who we're delighted to have here tonight, and some rising stars in the field. And the question here basically is, where does naturalism come from? What does it entail? And trying to offer new perspectives on what is a very significant and ongoing debate. So we're trying to give resources to the science and religion community and beyond about what's going on, what our historical roots are, what future possibilities exist, and trying to resort that discussion. But of course, the most important thing that the Ian Ramsay Centre does for many people is organise its annual conference. And in future years, we open up some interesting possibilities. Here's what we'll be looking at next year. This is what we'll be looking at: compassion and theodicy, Darwinism, suffering, and the human quest for meaning. In other words, we'll be looking at a question that's unquestionably scientific, but we'll be making broader cultural and theological connections, trying to open up these interesting discussions for wider discussion. And again, looking forward to 2020. There, we're having a discussion on natural theology. Is it an interface between the natural sciences, Christian theology, and a wider culture, or not? Obviously, I have my views, but there'll be others present who will have very different views. And hopefully this will give us a very good discussion and debate, which may well lead to some very important developments and syntheses. But of course, our 2018 conference, as Dr. Pinsent was reminding us, is about transhumanism, posthumanism, and supernaturalism. And what I want to do in this lecture, which is a public lecture, in many ways just laying some groundwork for those of you who are attending the conference and opening up some interesting questions for those of you who are honoured guests tonight, is to try and open up some issues in dialogue with C.S. Lewis. Now, of course, Lewis is a very interesting writer, and his book, The Abolition of Man, which came out in 1943, it's a difficult book, but it raises some really interesting questions about whether actually we are taking steps which, whether we intend it or not, are going to erode the distinctive nature of humanity so that what is left really can't be called humanity at all. And of course, Lewis followed through on this with a novel. There's a rather exciting cover, but it shows you the kind of popular appeal that Lewis was able to make use of in discussing this question, That Hideous Strength, which, as many of you will know, is the third and final volume of his science fiction trilogy. And I think it's a very important area, and Lewis I'll be coming back to later in this lecture, but I need to set context both for the debate and for Lewis's own contribution. So what's the best place to begin? Well, I think the best place to begin really is this innate human desire to be able to transcend our limits, to overcome barriers to our progress and development that we consider to be arbitrary or imprisoning. And you know, this desire might be enhanced by advances in genetics or robotics or nanotechnology, but actually they reach far back into our past. We seem to be discontented with our natural state and seek to develop our possibilities through cultural developments, through technology. For example, you might think of the ancient Greek story of Prometheus, who stole the secret of fire from the gods. And that's widely appropriate. Think of many Enlightenment writers, for example, as a symbol of the defiance of authority and tyranny on the part of adventurous human beings on the other, and the ability of technology to enable humanity to improve itself. Thus, through fire, humanity was able to smelt ore and make weapons and agricultural implements and open up new possibilities, whether those were good or bad, which were far advanced from what went before. And of course, it's no accident, I think, that Mary Shelley's very famous novel, Frankenstein, subtitled, look, The Modern Prometheus, is exploring very similar things. Through technology, human beings can do what only God was meant to do, namely create life and control the world. So let's just hold this in our minds. The idea that technology enables us to do things which might, in effect, enable us to displace God, and place this alongside another development which, although it has a history long before the 19th century, really became very important in Germany during the revolutionary period of the 1840s. And we're looking at, of course, this very well-known book by Ludwig Feuerbach, The Essence of Christianity, notice translated by George Eliot, who found his ideas very relevant for Victorian England. And Feuerbach's basic argument is that God, the idea of God, is not a human response to an external reality, something we're compelled to respond to, but is rather something that we ourselves create through perhaps a misreading of our own experience. So it's a human production, something we've created, and therefore, Feuerbach argues, something we can leave behind us as we move ahead. So you can see here two trajectories of thought. Technology opening up new possibilities, being able to dismiss, perhaps a little bit too quickly, I think, God as an inhibiting force in cultural development, and in effect setting the scene for the convergence of technology as a way of doing things, with the removal, at least in some circles, of God as an inhibiting force. And that clearly contributes to a confluence of two very significant cultural streams, which in effect move us towards our discussion tonight. And I might well quote C.S. Lewis to just make this point. Many of you will know this quote. I think it's rather good. Dreams of the far future destiny of man were dragging up from its shallow and unquiet grave the old dream of man as God. So clearly, the technological possibilities that we now confront are playing into a deeper cultural and religious agenda. And so it's very important to begin to explore where these might take us. In the past, you might think, for example, of Augustine of Hippo's very famous reflections on human nature. Why travel to see the wonders of the world when you can look at each other and marvel at what you see? Or indeed, you might think of Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of humanity, that almost like Renaissance manifesto, which takes delight in human achievements and possibilities. But those perhaps are now being challenged, because more recent schools of thought, I think, as Nick Bostrom points out, see human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. And that's a neat summary of, I think, a very important point. This feeling that we can now take control of the processes that have led us to where we are in order to make them take us where we would like to be. In other words, we understand through scientific analysis what's going on, and we can now take control of those processes and make them go where we want them to, rather than where they would naturally take us. And that is, I think, a really interesting question. This tension between the human and the transhuman, the posthuman. There are issues of definition here that I'm sure we'll be talking about a lot at the conference itself. But there are points, I think, that are really important. And that is that we no longer feel we accept our lot and make the best of it, but we feel we can do something which is going to change our situation. Whether that leads us in good directions or bad directions, because those are the issues under discussion. And certainly if we look at the Transhumanist Declaration, which was first drawn up in 1998 and then revised in 2009, what we see here are some very interesting ideas. Look at this. We envision the possibility of broadening human potential by overcoming aging. Now there's a rich theme. Cognitive shortcomings. In other words, we can actually reason better. We have enhanced reasoning, enhanced moral capacities, involuntary suffering, and our confinement to planet Earth. And this is a very powerful vision, as I think you can see. But it's not clear that it's that straightforward. And again, there are warning notes sounded. There are possible realistic scenarios that lead to the loss of most or even all of what we hold valuable, though all progress is change, not all change is progress. And again, Nick Bostrom, again, a leading representative of the school, I think is very wise and cautious, making the point that it is far from obviously true that an expansion of technological capabilities makes things go better. And that, I think, is one of the questions that Lewis is going to open up for us. If we abolish what is traditionally seen as human nature and replace it with something, well, better, to use the word in a very loose sense, actually, is that an improvement, or are we being placed in a new situation which may have advantages, but also disadvantages that we don't yet fully understand? And of course, there are real anxieties here. Here's one that goes back to 1970. I can remember reading this years ago and feeling partly this is unnecessarily worrying, and partly there might be something in this. This is Victor Furcus, writing in 1970. What if the new man combines the animal irrationality of primitive man with the calculated greed and powerlust of industrial man, while possessing the godlike powers granted him by technology? This would be the ultimate horror. Now, maybe he's overstating, but there's something there. I can remember, as someone who was born in 1953, going home one night, I'd been out in 1961, and found my parents really very, very upset. And it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they were genuinely frightened that new technology would lead to nuclear war, and were wondering how they were going to tell me about it. And you can see the kind of issues there that Furcus is raising. So let's look at an Oxford figure who thought about these questions, in effect to get our discussion going. When I mention this person's name, you will feel perhaps he is overly pessimistic about theology, but again, let's just listen to him and ask what questions he would want to raise. And it's J.R.R. Tolkien, and that looks to me as if he's in Merton College Gardens, probably in the winter, but basically this is a significant voice in any discussion of where technology is taking us. Why? Because Tolkien, an idealist as a young man, was caught up in the Great War, what we now call the First World War, but which at the time was portrayed as the war to end all wars. He joined the Lancashire Fusiliers as second lieutenant and witnessed at first hand the enormous destructiveness of military technology, above all the machine gun. And in effect, Tolkien lost many close friends, and some people wonder whether Tolkien's depiction of Mordor is actually just a reworking of First World War battlefields. But here's the point. Tolkien saw technology as depersonalizing war, making it a battle between machines, with human beings as the main planners, but also the main casualties of this new form of warfare. You know, Tolkien, he loved Anglo-Saxon literature and highlighted the importance of the hero, the individual warrior who showed bravery and honor in face-to-face conflict. And Tolkien found it impossible to reconcile that with an anonymous hail of bullets which destroyed individuals as a matter of statistical probability, not personal engagement. And for Tolkien, there was something wrong with technology. Now, he overstates, I think, but there is a point being made here. Technology has made it possible for us to achieve far more controlled destruction than our forebears. It's not so much that technology itself is bad, it's what we do with it. We can use it for good, we can use it for ill. The technology that helps us to heal is also a technology that helps us to kill. And of course, many of you will know that a very similar point has been made more recently by the philosopher John Gray in his book Straw Dogs. And again, some of you will feel this book overstates, but I have to say it overstates in a very interesting and engaging way. And in this book, Gray really is concerned to debunk what he thinks is the shallow humanism of much of Western culture, which is based on basically what he calls illusions about humanity. He sees religion as being one of those illusions, but also this rather simplistic belief in the goodness of humanity. That's also one of these consoling illusions that we hang on to. And Gray is acerbic about our failure to engage our moral ambiguity. And he makes the point that technology may be a good thing in some ways, but it's still subservient to selfish and corrupting human agendas, and it doesn't inevitably lead to either social or political progress. Here's one of his overstatements for you to reflect on. I quote, "Without the railways, telegraph, and poison gas, there could have been no Holocaust." In one sense, he's right. I think it's an overstatement, but it's a generative and stimulating overstatement which does open up some difficult questions. And the point that Gray is making is that weapons of mass destruction are human creations, and they're based on the application of science to nationalist or ideological ends. And I think you can see similar points being made elsewhere. I think of Primo Levi in his Black Hole of Auschwitz, who wrote that he inhabited a century in which science became warped, his word, creating again, his words, a gigantic death-dealing and corrupting machine. So this, I think, raises some very interesting questions. For example, whether we as human beings are cognitively and morally capable of dealing with the increasingly complex ethical issues that arise from technological development. And certainly there are writers who feel something can be done about it. You might think of Konrad Lorenz on his book on aggression, who says that we are intrinsically violent, but that there is a hope that one day we might learn or be helped to control this innate tendency towards violence. For Lorenz, this was kind of something he hoped might happen, although he was not sure it could be made to happen. But I think what we're seeing now is this feeling, now we understand how things happen naturally, we can take control of these things and use them for our own advantage. Now, there's one of the points that Lewis makes in the Abolition of Man, that perhaps at the time of the Renaissance, we had this idea science is about understanding our world. And that's wonderful. But Lewis sees a kind of transition taking place. We understand our world in order to master it and then make it serve our own ends and agendas. So we are faced here with something like this, a situation where we understand how, for example, the evolutionary process works. Can we now take that understanding and, in effect, make evolution redundant by doing these things ourselves with our own agendas in mind? And certainly E.O. Wilson is one of those who would say this seems to be the directions we're headed, and he raises some questions. So perhaps I need to try and give you an example of how understanding how things work enables us to change things with our own needs in mind. And the classic example, of course, is eugenics, social Darwinism, but I'm going to choose a different example because you've heard that so many times before. Let's look at Sigmund Freud, remembered for many things, but perhaps mostly for his emphasis on the influence of the human unconsciousness, on the way in which we think both individually and collectively. And of course, Freud was supplemented in the 1920s by people like Gustave Le Bon, who developed theories of crowd psychology, which helped to make sense of the way in which groups of human beings behaved in ways that differed from those of ordinary individuals. During the 1920s, Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, in effect reasoned like this. If we know the way crowds think, we can take control of that process and make them think what we want them to think. Bernays used the phrase public relations to refer to this process of taking control of what people thought, and actually proved to be very good at it. And one of his most successful applications of this was against one of the biggest American social taboos of the 1920s, women smoking in public. And so in 1929, he organized a parade in New York City, which featured famous female models holding Lucky Strike cigarettes, which Bernays designated tortures of freedom. And through convenient relationships with journalists, was able to secure virtually uniform positive coverage for the event, which proved decisive in changing public perceptions. And again, other examples could be given, but here's the point I want to make. After the Second World War, Bernays realized that he had in effect created a monster, that public opinion was inherently dangerous. And here's an example from his 1928 work, Propaganda, which basically is about how you take control of people. The conscious and intelligent manipulation, look at that word, of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested largely by men we've never heard of. It's they who pull the wires that control the public mind. And Bernays reckoned he'd found the right levers to pull. But after the war, he really became disillusioned. This wasn't good. And one of the reasons for this was his realization of who was using his approaches. Because in his autobiography, he tells of what he discovered about Nazi Germany. Here's what he said. Karl von Wiegand, foreign correspondent of the Hearst newspapers, an old hand interpreting Europe and just returned from Germany, was telling us about Goebbels and his propaganda plans to consolidate Nazi power. Goebbels had shown Wiegand his propaganda library, the best Wiegand had ever seen. Goebbels, said Wiegand, was using my book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, as a basis for his destructive campaign against the Jews of Germany. Now, you can see the point I'm trying to make. You understand how things work, you make them work for your ends. That might be good, but Bernays began to realize this wasn't good. And that, I think, is the issue. Who is taking control of these things? If we know how things work and take control of them, who is the we who is actually doing this controlling? Is it humanity in general, or is it certain human beings who have agendas and are using this to promote them? So that is an issue that we will look at when we come to C.S. Lewis. But it seems to me that there are some issues we need to just look at before we come to C.S. Lewis. The transhumanist writer Nick Bostrom, as we saw a few moments ago, argued that the technological enhancement of humanity could lead to the emergence of posthumans, who could be expected to live far longer than we do. And Bostrom suggests 500 years, and would have significantly enhanced cognitive capabilities. And I'm sure, if you think about that, you'll raise precisely the questions I'm going to raise now in this brief list of 3 concerns. Number 1, these technological enhancements may be possible, but they are extremely expensive, and therefore it's simply going to increase global inequality. And my point is simply, this almost certainly means that the first posthumans may well turn out to be wealthy Americans. Now, nothing against Americans, but you've got to be realistic about this. This is expensive. Who gets it? Well, it's something to think about. Here's another one. Supposing we do indeed expand our lifespan to 500 years, and you can see immediately that certain problems emerge. The world is already running out of water. Here in England, we're having water shortages. And if you read Thomas Malthus's very famous essay on the principle of population, which had such a big impact on Charles Darwin's understanding of, for example, how extinction took place, on competition for resources and so on, then given that the Earth has limited resources, it can only sustain a certain number of people. And that clearly raises questions. If we're going to live to 500, that's 7 times what we might expect, then the Earth is going to be overpopulated, and there will be competition, which can only lead to the kind of mechanisms for controlling population that Malthus noted back in the late 1700s, war or famine. That doesn't sound good to me. There has to be something else there to deal with that. And the third point is that I think it is intensely contestable that there is any correlation between cognitive capacity and moral discernment. That, I think, is a belief many have, but I'm not sure it's well grounded. To use more theological language, perhaps we might ask whether the rise of posthumanism or transhumanism offers us an escape from sin, or whether actually it makes us more vulnerable to it, in that if we are predisposed to do certain things, we now are able to do them more effectively, so they have more important implications. Transhumanism, at least some transhumanists, seem to think that perhaps being able to reason more effectively means that we don't do certain things because we know they're wrong. But if we remain intrinsically selfish, then we're able to reason how to serve our own ends even more effectively. So there are, I think, some questions there that really are important. So let me bring E.O. Wilson into the conversation, because many of you will be expecting me to talk about people like him, who in effect are worried about what is going on. And in his Social Conquest of the Earth, which came out in 2012, he suggests that the difficulty is that we are prisoners of our evolutionary past, and we can never completely break free from that. And therefore we are caught up in a difficult situation that, his words, the worst in our nature coexists with the best, and so it will ever be. And Wilson says, look, we've created a Star Wars civilization, but we have Stone Age emotions. And he's worried about that problem about human nature. If we can do far more than we were able to do in the past, that doesn't mean we do things better. It just means we're able to do things more effectively for the promotion of certain agendas. And actually, he has quite an important ally here in Thomas Huxley, who many of you will know as Darwin's great supporter and advocate and interpreter, I think I must say as well, in the late 19th century. And in 1893, he came to Oxford to give the Romanes lecture. That is a big public lecture organized by Oxford University. And his theme was this: evolution and ethics. And I wonder what you thought he had to say about this. Actually, it's a remarkably good lecture. You can find it on the web without the slightest difficulty. It is thoughtful, it's engaging, and it is worried. Why is he worried? Basically, he begins by making the point that humans have triumphed in their evolutionary struggle for existence through their cunning, through their ruthless and ferocious destructiveness. Yet, he argues, human beings, having subdued the remainder of the sentient world, now find that these deeply ingrained serviceable qualities have become defects. In other words, he's arguing that the violence and ruthlessness that we use in the struggle for existence are not reconcilable with sound ethical principles. And so ethics for Huxley has to be a principled resistance to precisely those animal qualities that secured the human domination of the biosphere in the first place. And this means, he says, that we must be able to subjugate the animal instincts that linger within us. The practice of that which is ethically best, what we call goodness or virtue, involves a course of conduct which in all respects is opposed to that which leads to success in the cosmic struggle for existence. Now that seems to me to be a very important warning shot, because he's arguing whether actually we can change our natures, whether we can leave behind us this evolutionary past, and in effect say, that was then, but this is now, and it's different. And Huxley's wondering if actually we can do this, and he is certainly saying that a knowledge of what happens in evolution is no recipe for that being ethically right. If anything, ethics is about a reversal, a contesting of the factors in evolutionary progress. Let's go back to one point that Nick Bostrom made, and that is, in effect, there's this desire to overcome what we might call the ultimate limit, which is human mortality. And there are many who've commented on this innate human desire to try and stop the aging process, to try and, in effect, declare death as an enemy that's been defeated. For example, Peter Berger suggests human mortality is the ultimate unbearable truth. And he says that, in effect, for many people, mortality is a symbol or a sign of a terrifying meaninglessness and chaos that characterizes human existence in the world. And of course, there are many other ways of reading that. For example, Ernst Becker's very famous book, The Denial of Death, back in 1973, it just said, look, we are driven by the desire to deny death, or to transcend it, or to create meaning in its face. And history, happily, is full of lots of interesting examples of attempts to try and evade mortality. And one of the most interesting is flagged up by John Gray, who I mentioned earlier, in his book, The Immortalization Commission. And it all features on the immortal Lenin, who is there. And I have to say, Lenin is dead, all right. But this is what the point that, that Gray makes, that basically there was a feeling that Marxism and Lenin had changed the world socially and economically, but had not really dealt with the issue of death. And so therefore, immortalizing Lenin in some way would have been seen as a symbol of the permanency of Marxism and Leninism and its ability to engage the deepest questions of nature. And so a German technologist, Krassin, in effect argued he could prevent Lenin from corrupting. And so, in effect, they built a mausoleum, and in it was Lenin's body. And the problem, of course, was that Lenin's body soon began to show unmistakable signs of decay. And Krassin asked for a better refrigerator from Germany to stop this happening. And so, basically, the story is that of innumerable attempts to kind of way prevent anyone from noticing that Lenin was eroding in front of people's eyes. But that's interesting, but it just delays our engagement with Lewis. So let's move straight on to him and ask how he plays into this discussion. The Abolition of Man is not an easy book. As many of you will know, it was a series of lectures given at Durham back in 1943. There are 3 lectures. It's the third, which is actually entitled The Abolition of Man, which gives the whole book the title, which is so important for us. And there are 2 themes that stand out in this chapter. The one that I think is most interesting is an insight that recurs in Lewis's novels and in his inaugural lecture at Cambridge University, namely, that we destroy our own humanity if we treat ourselves merely as a means to something else, rather than as an autonomous, rational end in ourselves. And Lewis's big concern, which comes up in this book, but again in that hideous strength, is that the possibility is now real that we can, through what we now know as genetic engineering or social conditioning, program people to behave exactly as we wish them. The we in that sentence does need clarification. Who is this we? And for Lewis, this amounts to dehumanization, in that these programmed or reprogrammed entities could not be people in any meaningful sense of the term. They would not be beings other than ourselves with a mind of their own. They were, for Lewis, simply artifacts, things that we've constructed or developed, things that we could use for the advancement of our own ends, but not persons we could communicate with, share with, identify with, or love. And so in The Abolition of Man, Lewis points out that loose talk about human power, human capacity, is actually a recognition that such power is possessed by some human beings who proceed to use this power to control or manipulate other human beings. And so his point is that every new human capacity that we invent or discover is not so much about the triumph of humanity over nature, but actually is about the triumph of one section of humanity over nature and other human beings. It's an implicit recognition of power of some people to control other people. And that's the point that Lewis was trying to make in this statement, which I think is a standout quote from that book. Man's final conquest has proved to be the abolition of man. Now, what does he mean by that, and what does he think we can do about it? The key point here for Lewis is to do with morality. But I think we could extend this beyond that, but just to be faithful to Lewis, let's focus on morality. Lewis is arguing there's some kind of natural morality, the Tao, a sort of natural law, something like that, which is not something we construct, not something we control, but is something that we ought to respect. It's external to us, not something that we've produced or constructed. And the point that Lewis is making is this means we all honor and respect those values. But if we say that human values are human constructions, things constructed by individuals or groups, then we open the way to one such social grouping, in effect determining that they can act in certain ways, which leads to the oppression of others. And this, I think, leads to Lewis. What I think it's one of Lewis's most interesting quotes, which I'll quote to you now. It's, I think, quite prophetic. Man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. Either we are obliged forever to obey the absolute value, the Tao, or else we are mere nature to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters, who must, by hypothesis, have no motive but their own natural impulses. In other words, what if some develop a value system which means we are really human and you are not, and therefore we have control over you? And of course, Lewis saw this happening in the ideologies of his age. And Lewis echoes a concern that I think many have, and I think there are many examples we could give of this, and probably, as I've been talking, many people are thinking of H.G. Wells' novel, The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is, of course, a dystopian account of how understanding how evolution works makes us wonder if we can short-circuit the process and maybe move it in directions that we find palatable and helpful. But I think it's G.K. Chesterton that really summarizes this very, very well in his book, What's Wrong with the World? Chesterton's answer to that was a lot, and he fully conceded he was part of the problem, but he also identified another problem, which is the view that human nature can be changed and that science enables us to understand how we, again, a privileged we, can change it. When one begins to think of man as a shifting and alterable thing, it's always easy for the strong and crafty to twist him into new shapes for all kinds of unnatural purposes. It's a very well-grounded guess that whatever is done swiftly and systematically will mostly be done by a successful class, and almost solely in their interests. Now again, there may be overstatement there, but surely there is something in that that alerts us to a potential problem. Not humanity as a whole taking control of an evolutionary process, but certain people taking control of it and using it for their own ends. And that seems to me to be a very important point. What Lewis and Chesterton were both worried about was not merely the manipulation of human identity, but the arguably more troublesome question of just who is doing this manipulation and with what intended outcomes. When we talk about human power over nature, do we really mean the power of some people over other people, using nature as an instrument to wield that power? Now, there's a book by Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu, which some of you will have read, Unfit for the Future, The Need for Moral Enhancement. And this, I think, is a very important book to look at, because in effect it raises questions which I think we do need to engage with. I think it's very difficult not to read this book without being reinforced in terms of slight anxiety about some of the ways in which we are going if we follow those who believe they can control our moral judgments and have some right to determine what we think by reprogramming us. I'm going to draw on Susan Neiman, who's director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam, in just raising some concerns about this approach. because her argument is that there's an assumption that we all know something is wrong, and therefore having the means by which we can put it right constitutes a legitimation of the means that we must use. For example, she says, look, according to Person and Savulescu, everyone knows that climate change is happening, but nobody's got the moral fiber to take the necessary steps to change things. Everyone knows that terrorists could use biological or nuclear weapons to wreak mass destruction, but no one's willing to set aside alleged rights to privacy in order to support surveillance that could help identify terrorists who might use such weapons. And her point is there's a dangerous tendency here to argue that in the past, dictators used pretext for government, but now we know what needs to be done, and that legitimates us in doing that. So that seems to me to be a very interesting point. She's arguing that we now feel we face a real state of emergency which requires measures such as surveillance and limitation of human freedoms to change things. But again, the question is, who are the we here? Aldous Huxley's novel, I think, raises some very interesting questions. Here's a very lurid American version of his book, A Brave New World, which I read, and I have to say, it's one of those books you're glad you've read, even though it is quite uncomfortable. It's a troubling account of this kind of society in which human beings were reprogrammed in what he calls hatcheries and human conditioning centers to conform to the will of their controllers, including the generation of people of lower intelligence in what he calls the social predestination room, to facilitate their conformity to the needs of the world state. Now, you've read this book. We'll know again, there is always this question, is this simply exaggeration, is this scaremongering, or is he raising real questions for our reflection? So I'm going to end in a moment. I'm going to end by just noting the passing of Stephen Hawking, who I think many of us read with great interest. And as some of you will know, late last year, in November of last year, he was at a conference in Lisbon talking about artificial intelligence and raising some concerns. And again, as these were pretty much towards the end of his life, I think it is worth looking at these. Here's one thing he said. Unless we learn how to prepare for and avoid the potential risks, artificial intelligence could be the worst event in the history of our civilization. It brings dangers like powerful autonomous weapons or new ways for the few to oppress the many. And again, it's that point. The few are enabled to oppress the many. Lewis's point. And in an interview just before the conference, he said something else. I fear that artificial intelligence may replace humans altogether. If people design computer viruses, then someone's going to design artificial intelligence that improves and replicates itself. This will be a new form of life that outperforms humans. And if so, then we're not necessarily talking about the abolition of humanity, but maybe we are talking about humanity becoming an endangered species. So, ladies and gentlemen, there's much food here for thought. And I think you'll agree that my opening reflection has solved absolutely nothing, although I hope it will kind of way function as an intellectual bonne bouche, stimulating the palate and laying the ground for some of the more precise and focused interventions and discussions which we'll be having in the main conference over the next 2 days. I think it promises to be a most stimulating session, opening up possibilities and mapping areas for discussion. I'm sure we're going to have a wonderful time together. To our guests, you've been most welcome. I hope this kind of mapping of a complex territory will raise lots of interesting questions and perhaps persuade you the Ian Ramsey Centre really is doing some very interesting work in opening up those questions for wide discussion. And to those of you who've just joined us for this evening alone, you're most welcome, and keep an eye out for what we're doing in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.
We have a bit of time and a bit of time for Q&A at 10 or 15 minutes or so. Hopefully, I don't think we've got a microphone at the back. There's a microphone at the back. Is that good? And I need a volunteer to help carry the microphone around. So There's some young volunteer. Yes, Dr. Silva, back all the way from Argentina. Thank you.
He's done this before.
That's well, actually. Fantastic, great. Thank you very much.
So who'd like to begin?
You just wait until the microphone reaches you, and we'll catch it. Thank you. I think it's gentleman there, wasn't there, in the middle there?
Thank you. Didn't expect to be the first. As I noticed, one of the main problems you identify from the perspective of C.S. Lewis, but not only, is that very few can, not the whole humanity, but just a small part of it may take control and then misuse new technologies and so on. But me, I'm a theologian, and I am aware that theology brings much more and diverse criticism to transhumanism than this one. And I am wondering how would you see, where would you see the place of theological criticism in the global debate on transhumanism and artificial intelligence and new technologies? Because it's a question I struggle very much with, is how can theology still be relevant in such a dialogue when its background is so radically different? I mean, it makes some assumptions about anthropology and what humans are, in fact, and what their destiny is, that these claims are so different from what people like Nick Bostrom are claiming, then I don't know how theology can still be relevant and taken seriously by a non-theological audience.
Well, I think theology can do two things that are really quite important here. Number one is it can raise questions for discussion. Number two, it can also present a different way of thinking about things. In other words, inviting you to step into an imaginative way of looking at things from which perspective you begin to realize that this proposal actually has some problems. So I think those are two important techniques. So let me just talk about some of the responses we might, as theologians, bring to a debate like this. Number one, I think obviously the Christian idea of sin is complex and indeed contested. But what we might say is let's just bring a writer like Augustine of Hippo into this conversation. Let him put his concerns on the table and ask where those take us. And one of Augustine's concerns is that actually there's something intrinsically flawed about us, which means that when we are put in a situation where the possibility of the exercise of power is possible, then in effect that will disclose what we really are in terms of being self-serving. And I'm skeptical about the merits of Abraham Lincoln as a theologian. But, his point, you give a man power, and then you see what he's really like. I mean, that is such a perceptive comment. And of course, a very similar thing comes from Augustine, that in effect, it is when you're able to do things that your true nature begins to show itself. And for Augustine, that true nature, in effect, is very often self-serving. And that is a real issue. What can we do to stop us being self-serving? Because actually, very often, when you hear people talking about stopping being selfish, you may mean not being individually selfish, but still to do with your kin group or your family, something like that. So that's the first thing I think you can do. I think the second thing is to begin to articulate a wider picture. Maybe theology can in effect help us to do this, perhaps by asking, whether in effect we are doing something which is permanently going to change who we are as human beings. And we're unsure whether this is good or bad, but we have this deep sense that we're taking steps which are irreversible. And therefore, the very least we could do is ask whether this is a wise thing to do. In other words, are we crossing some kind of, Weissman barrier, just to give you an example, which actually is going to influence those who come after us, and it's going to change us fundamentally. I think that's the kind of thing I see in Chesterton. It's the kind of thing I think I see Stephen Hawking raising there in his concerns about artificial intelligence, that actually we are making steps which may actually be life-changing for the future of humanity, and we're kind of walking into the situation slightly befuddled, not really seeing things very clearly, but there's almost like this imperative which comes from technological development itself. In other words, because we are able to do this, we will do it. And that, I think, is a real concern. It's very, very difficult to stop this happening. The question we could ask realistically is, if it goes wrong, how can we kind of way reset the mechanism? And that to me is a good question. So for me, theology does something very important to say here. And we might also just make that point, which goes back to my point about Feuerbach. In effect, what Feuerbach was saying is there's no limit. There's nothing to stop you doing what you want, because God is kind of way something you create out of your own experience. Supposing Feuerbach is wrong. I mean, Feuerbach in many ways is instantiating the whole idea that you create worldviews that are convenient for you, and certainly his view there's no God allowed him to pursue his own agendas without any kind of hindrance. But if he is wrong, then of course there is a limit. There is someone we're accountable to. And while that doesn't actually give you a neat answer to a complex problem, it gives you this informing context which makes you attentive to where this might take us, and realizing actually we could be doing something significant that might be irreversible, and asking what we can do if things go wrong. But I need to say much more, but that's the beginnings of an answer to a very good question. Thank you. Who would like to go next, please? We have a question here in the front.
My question is just basic. Do you use the word religion and theology interchangeably, or when you're really using the word theology, you're talking about a Christian vision?
Thank you. Am I using the word theology and the word religion more or less interchangeably? I don't think so. I mean, I think that obviously, the word religion is intensely difficult to define. I mean, you might offer a definition of religion which seems very neat yet excludes Buddhism, and you have to ask, what you actually mean by religion. But I think most people understand religion in terms of not simply ideas, but also rituals, practices, values, and so on. In other words, something with many layers, whereas theology is really a cerebralization, an attempt to try and develop ideas which may emerge out of religious practice and religious reflection, perhaps engaging with certain core texts, but it's actually on a slightly different level. And I think that for me, they are quite different. And certainly if you read someone like Goethe, I mean, Goethe loved religion, but thought theology was awful because, in effect, it tried to reduce to neat little ideas, things that were too complex and indeed too deep to actually be allowed to do that. So in my response to the previous question, I was really talking about Christian theology explicitly. But of course, others will give different answers, but I suspect that some very similar issues would be raised in that way. So basically, for the purpose of that question, I was talking specifically about theology. But religion versus theology, I mean, for me, theology is something that is helpful, but actually it's religion itself which is perhaps more important, because that is engaging perhaps deeper questions about identity and meaning and value, which actually is sometimes quite difficult to put into words. They're kind of hot emotions, if you like, or hot perceptions, which we find very, very difficult to verbalize, even though I realize we have to verbalize them if we're going to be able to discuss them at all. I need to say more about that, but that's a very brief answer to that. Let's keep going. We have a question here, I think, and then up there, and that may be all we have time for. So one here, and then we're going up here. Okay, thank you.
Right. Thank you for the excellent lecture. I'm not sure if this question is exactly relevant. So I'm from the natural sciences, and right around the time when C.S. Lewis was writing that, here at Oxford, up there at the biochemistry building, Hans Krebs was discovering how all life produces energy. And then a little bit after that book came out, the structure of DNA was being discovered at Cambridge. What I'm wondering is that the discussion about transhumanism, posthumanism, and you yourself just mentioned that technology begets technology, which Kevin Kelly kind of describes in his book, What Technology Wants. We don't actually discuss or think about any of this at all. So the DPhil program here in biochemistry or stuff, we don't think about this at all. So how do you actually have this conversation where the hard sciences or the natural sciences that are actually begetting that technology, how do we actually think about what you're talking about without sorry to mention it, but without bringing religion and theology into the discussion, but more about.
Yeah, I get you. That's a really good question. Let me just give you something that interests you. You're right. I mean, Lewis, he's in this period. There's Krebs there, and later, of course, there's Crick and Watson. But interesting, at Malden College, where Lewis was based, Peter Medawar was there for a while, and he talked to Lewis. And actually, his view was that Lewis didn't really get science. That Lewis kind of way may have seen science as making metaphysical claims, which actually most scientists wouldn't make, although he realized that some did. So he's just a little bit skeptical whether Lewis quite grasped what science was all about. But let's leave that to one side, because the question you raise is a very, very good one. I guess one of the issues is, how do we get natural scientists who are very, very focused on research to think about the broader implications of what they're doing? I think it's hard. I think it's hard for several reasons. One is because you're so focused on research. But I think the really interesting group of scientists, and I do describe these people as scientists, are actually medics, because that is really where you have this interplay between a body of technological knowledge and technological techniques, but you're actually dealing with people. And how do you kind of navigate that boundary? And certainly, my perception, as someone who's now quite old, is that my friends who are medics began being very techie, and then ended up, developing the human skills, which actually made them more effective as healers. It's a bit like, if you go back to Oslo, who was here in Oxford in the early 1900s, he was very concerned to get this balance right between being a human being for another human being, but also being a human being who knew something about techniques to bring to bear in these situations. So it seems to me that might be an area where there is something to be said about trying to rehumanize a discipline which could quite easily simply become technocratic. And I do understand why medics, kind of distance themselves. I mean, because it's very stressful when you're dealing with someone who is seriously ill, and you refer to them as, for example, the appendix or whatever it is the problem is. But nevertheless, it's just trying to make sure we see these people as human beings. So I think there's a real need for the kind of discussion you've described. I'm not sure I have the answer as to how we do it, but I'm so pleased you've raised the question. I think it's a good one. And we have a last question just up here, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd agree with this last question as well. As a DPhil in synthetic biology, it's never raised at all. My question was more not just applying it to the scientists, but to real-life actions, policy. Is there anything, how can we take what we learn from these writings and transfer it into something, if what you're saying is it's inevitable, really, that we are going in this direction? How do we turn it into legislation?
I think that is a question which is, as Barack Obama would say, beyond my pay grade. But it is a good question. I mean, I think one of the questions we have to say is we need to get a balance between understanding how things work and trying to work out what is good. How do we help people live good lives? And in part that's to do with the alleviation of poverty, but there's more to it than that. It is trying to cast a vision of what human nature might be, asking what we could do to advance that. And if you're a natural scientist, there may well be something you can do. I mean, my niece, who's just finished her medical studies, is going to join Médecins Sans Frontières because she feels that's where she could be useful. And I honour that completely. And I think one of the questions we could ask is, here's what I'm good at. Is there any way I can use this for the good of other people? Whether that good is simply enabling them to survive or giving them a better quality of life. And that seems to me to be a helpful way of starting that conversation, even though it doesn't go very far. And I think that one of the things that I would want to say is that I fully understand that science is about understanding how our world works. Albert Einstein gave a wonderful lecture on the relationship of science and religion at Princeton back in 1939. And he, as you might expect, he was just saying how wonderful science is. But then he said, actually, it doesn't really help us to become better people. The desire to do that has to come from somewhere else. And so really it's a question of whether we're actually saying, maybe we need to enrich science with something else, which helps us take what is good and use it for good things. And for Einstein, although Einstein's religion was perhaps somewhat complex, his argument was that in its generic sense, religion is about this bigger vision of reality, this bigger vision of humanity, which energizes you and motivates you and makes you want to do something that goes beyond simply understanding how things work. I think there's something in that. The question is, how do we motivate ourselves and others to want to go that extra mile? And that's where I would say that a conversation between science and religion is helpful. I think that it closes down nothing but opens up lots of interesting possibilities. And it just seems to me that's a kind of very creative, constructive conversation that we do need to have. We've had 4 wonderful questions. We've run out of time, but ladies and gentlemen, again, thank you so much for coming tonight. It's been wonderful having you.